The rain over Brooklyn wasn't just falling. It was assaulting the cobblestones of Dumbo, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that usually served as a lullaby for Elias Thorne's work, but tonight, it felt like a warning. Inside the Thorne and Sons Restoration Workshop, the air was a carefully climate-controlled cocktail of vanilla-scented lignin, rabbit skin glue, and the heavy, musky dust of centuries past. It was a smell that most people found sneezing-inducing, but to Elias, it was the scent of time itself being held in stasis. Elias adjusted the arm of his magnifying lamp, the halo of cool white light illuminating a square foot of history on his workbench. At 34, Elias possessed the hands of a surgeon and the soul of a monk. He lived his life in the margins, quite literally, spending his days scrutinizing the edges of pages that others merely turned. Tonight, the patient on his operating table was royalty. It was the first edition, the 1974 pristine print of The Silent Lark by Eleanor Vance. To the literary world, this physical object was the Holy Grail, the vessel that had carried the great American novel into existence. To the Eleanor Vance Heritage Foundation, it was an asset valued at over $2 million, centerpiece of the upcoming centenary gala. To Elias, it was a job, a high-pressure, terrifyingly delicate job that paid enough to keep his shop open for another 2 years. He picked up his bone folder, a smooth, polished tool made from genuine cattle bone, and ran it gently along the gutter of the book. The binding was failing. The original adhesive, a synthetic nightmare from the 70s, had crystallized, threatening to snap the spine if the book was opened too aggressively. His task was invasive but necessary. Lift the original leather, scrape away the decayed glue, reinforce the spine with archival Japanese tissue, and lay the original leather back down so seamlessly that not even a microscope could detect the intervention. It was the kind of work that required a suspended breath and a slow heartbeat. Elias took a sip of cold coffee, his eyes never leaving the crimson Morocco leather of the cover. He felt the weight of the book, not just in ounces, but in cultural gravity. Eleanor Vance was a saint. The Silent Lark was the book that was taught in every high school, the story of a mute girl in the rural Midwest who possessed a transcendent, almost supernatural empathy for the natural world. It was the book that taught America how to feel again after the cynicism of the post-Vietnam era. Restoring it felt less like carpentry and more like prayer. He picked up his scalpel. It was a surgical number 11 blade, sharp enough to cut a single blood cell in half. He needed to make an incision along the hinge of the spine, separating the leather from the board. He exhaled, his hand moving with the fluid, practiced grace of a man who had done this 10,000 times. The blade sank into the leather, butter-soft despite its age. He drew the line, a perfect, microscopic slice. Then he stopped. A frown creased his forehead. Through the handle of the scalpel, he had felt something. A texture. A resistance. It was subtle, a sensation that a layman would have missed entirely, but Elias knew the anatomy of a book better than he knew his own body. Under the leather and the cardboard backing, there shouldn't have been anything but the spine lining, usually a mesh of mull or perhaps a layer of craft paper. But the blade had grazed something that felt fibrous. Something that crunched ever so slightly, like dried leaves. He withdrew the blade and switched to a micro spatula. With agonizing slowness, he lifted the flap of leather he had just cut. Beneath the crimson skin of the book, the cardboard was slightly delaminate. It wasn't a manufacturing defect. It looked intentional. Someone had pried the layers of the heavy cover board apart, created a pocket, and then resealed it. Elias's heart rate kicked up a notch. In his line of work, finding things inside books wasn't uncommon. He had found pressed flowers from the Victorian era, love letters from the 1920s, even a forgotten $20 bill from the Great Depression. But this was different. This wasn't something slipped between the pages. This was something surgically implanted into the body of the book itself. It was hidden to never be found, or perhaps, hidden to be found only when the book was broken. Using fine-tipped tweezers, he gently probed the cavity. He caught the edge of something white. Slowly, terrified he might tear it, he pulled. It was a piece of paper. Not book paper. This was thinner, cheaper, onion skin typing paper, folded into a tight, flat square about the size of a matchbook. It was stained with age, the edges yellowed and brittle. Elias placed the folded square on a clean sheet of blotting paper. The thunder outside cracked, shaking the window frames, but Elias didn't flinch. His entire universe had narrowed down to the small, intrusive object. Why would someone hide this in the binding of the very first copy of the Silent Lark? This copy had belonged to the Vance estate until it was transferred to the Foundation. It had never been in circulation. He used the tweezers to unfold it. The paper resisted, holding the memory of the fold for 50 years. 1 fold, 2 folds, 3. It smoothed out into a standard letter-sized sheet, though the edges were jagged, as if it had been ripped violently from a typewriter or a notebook. The paper was covered in handwriting. Elias leaned in, adjusting the magnification lamp. He knew Eleanor Vance's handwriting intimately. He had studied facsimiles of her manuscripts. Her hand was sweeping, elegant, with loops that spoke of a classical education and a calm mind. This was not that. The ink was black, pressed so hard into the thin paper that it had nearly punched through. The letters were angular, sharp, chaotic. The lines slanted downward, a graphological sign of depression or exhaustion. It looked like the writing of someone scribbling in the dark or in a fury. He began to read. October 14th, 1973. The basement is cold today. The furnace is broken again, or maybe she turned it off. She likes it when I'm cold. She says the cold makes my mind sharper, makes the birds in my head sing louder. Elias paused, a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty shop crawling up his spine. Who is she? He continued reading, his eyes darting across the frantic scroll. She came down at noon with the tray. Soup and bread. She didn't look at me. She never looks at me when she takes the pages. I saw her hands, manicured, perfect, smelling of that lavender lotion she wears for the press. My hands are gray with graphite and ink. She took the stack from the table. The chapter about the lark dying in the snow. I cried when I wrote that. I cried until I vomited. Eleanor just picked it up and checked the word count. Good, she said. The editor is coming tomorrow. I need more on the father's grief. Write it tonight. I wanted to scream. I opened my mouth, but only that croak came out. The sound that makes her wince. The sound that made Mother lock me away. Hush, Clara, she said, patting my head like I was a dog. You're doing God's work. You're the vessel. I'm just the voice. Remember? The world isn't ready for a monster like you. They would burn these pages if they knew they came from a twisted thing. I'm saving you. She locked the door. I can hear her upstairs, practicing reading my words in the mirror. She changes the rhythm. She smooths out the edges. She turns my blood into her ink. I am the shadow. She is the thief of light. But the lark is mine. The silence is mine. And one day, even if I have to burn this house down to do it, they will know. Clara. Elias sat back, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. The silence of the workshop was suddenly deafening. He looked at the book, the masterpiece, the Pulitzer winner, the beacon of American literature. And then he looked at the paper. Clara. History said Eleanor Vance was an only child. Her biography, the voice of a generation, spent 3 chapters detailing her solitary childhood, how she invented imaginary friends to cope with her loneliness. But this letter, this was specific. The basement. The soup. The mute sister. Elias stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street. A car drove by, its headlights sweeping across the front of his shop, casting long, moving shadows across the rows of leather-bound spines. For a second, the shadows looked like bars. If this paper was real, everything he knew, everything the world knew about Eleanor Vance, was a lie. A fabrication built on the enslavement of a sibling. The implications were nauseating. The foundation, the awards, the statues, the curriculum, it was all fruit from a poisoned tree. He turned back to the workbench. He should call someone. But who? The foundation? Marcus Sterling, the man who had handed him the book with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, emphasizing the need for absolute discretion? If Sterling knew about this, Elias would be walking into a lion's den. If Sterling didn't know, he would do anything to protect the billion-dollar industry that revolved around Eleanor's saintly image. Elias looked at the document again. Twisted thing. Monster. What did that mean? Was Clara physically deformed? Mentally ill? He needed verification. He couldn't go public with a single scrap of paper found in a binding. They would call it a forgery, a hoax created by a desperate bookbinder looking for 15 minutes of fame. He needed a trail. He grabbed his laptop, the blue light of the screen harsh compared to the warm glow of his work lamp. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He typed, Eleanor Vance family history. Results flooded in. The standard bio. Only child. Parents, Arthur and Lillian Vance, wealthy textile merchants in upstate New York. Arthur died in 1970. Lillian in 1972. Eleanor lived in the family estate, Blackwood, until her death in 2001. Elias deleted the search. He typed, Vance family birth records 1948. Nothing specific online. Most records from that era in rural New York hadn't been fully digitized or were sealed. He typed, Clara Vance. Did you mean Clara Vance, musician? Did you mean Clara Evans? Nothing. As far as the internet was concerned, Clara Vance had never drawn a breath. Elias closed the laptop. The storm outside was intensifying, thunder rattling the antique tools on the wall. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to hide the paper. Not just put it in a drawer, but hide it. He felt watched. The glass front of his shop, usually a window to the world, now felt like a vulnerability. Anyone could be out there in the dark, looking in. He carefully placed the letter between two sheets of acid-free mylar. He walked to the back of the shop, to a heavy, cast-iron safe hidden behind a stack of faux book spines. He dialed the combination, the tumblers clicking with a reassuring weight. He placed the mylar envelope inside, next to his passport and a small stash of emergency cash. As he closed the heavy iron door, a thought struck him. The ink. He went back to the workbench. He grabbed his UV light, a tool used to detect mold and modern paper brighteners. He shone it on the book, right where he had extracted the paper. Under the ultraviolet light, faint traces of adhesive fluoresced. But there was something else. On the cardboard itself, under the layer where the paper had been hidden, there was a faint indentation, invisible to the naked eye but highlighted by the shadows of the UV beam. It was a symbol. A crude drawing scratched into the cardboard with a fingernail or a pin. A bird. A lark. But it had no beak. Elias shivered. It was a signature. A desperate, silent claim to ownership etched into the very bones of the book. He switched off the UV light. The darkness of the shop seemed to press in closer. He wasn't just restoring a book anymore. He had just become the sole witness to a 50-year-old crime scene. He looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m. He knew he wouldn't sleep. The grand gala was in 5 days. He had 5 days to decide whether to finish the job and take the money, or to pull a thread that could unravel the entire literary world. He grabbed his coat. He couldn't stay here. He needed to go to where it started. He needed to go to Blackwood, or at least, to the town that lived in its shadow. He needed to find the ghost. Elias locked the front door of his shop, the bell jingling softly. He stepped out into the rain, the water instantly soaking his hair, mingling with the cold sweat on his forehead. He hailed a cab, the yellow light approaching through the mist like a predator's eye. "Where to?" the driver asked, eyeing Elias's disheveled appearance in the rearview mirror. Elias hesitated. He looked back at his shop, dark and silent. "Penn Station," Elias said, his voice steadying. "I need to catch the first train upstate." As the taxi pulled away, splashing through the puddles, Elias didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street, its engine idling, its wipers beating a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He didn't see the man in the driver's seat lift a phone to his ear, his eyes fixed on the retreating taillights of Elias's cab. The game had begun, and Elias was already losing. The train rattled north along the Hudson line, a steel snake cutting through the pre-dawn gray. Outside the grime-streaked window, the river was a churning expanse of slate, indistinguishable from the sky, broken only by the skeletal silhouettes of bare trees and the occasional rusted industrial skeleton of a factory long abandoned. Elias Thorne sat in the last car, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, the vibration of the tracks humming through his skull. He hadn't slept. The caffeine from the night before had curdled into a jagged anxiety that sat heavy in his stomach. Every time the conductor walked by, punching tickets with a mechanical click-click, Elias flinched, pulling his coat tighter around himself as if the wool could shield him from the truth he was carrying in his pocket. The letter, Clara's letter, was no longer in the safe. He had gone back for it at the last second, a reckless impulse driven by the paranoia that if he left it behind, it would disappear. It was now taped to his chest, beneath his undershirt, a layer of paper burning against his skin like a brand. He was heading to Oakhaven, a sleepy hamlet nestled in the Hudson Valley, the place where the Vance family dynasty had built its fortress and where Eleanor Vance was buried. It was a pilgrimage site for literary tourists, a town that had commodified its association with the saint of American letters. Elias had been there once before, years ago, on a field trip during his apprenticeship. He remembered it as picturesque, a manicured postcard of small-town America. But as the train slowed, screeching into the station under the relentless October drizzle, Oakhaven looked different. It looked like a set piece whose paint was peeling. Elias stepped onto the platform, the cold air biting at his exposed face. The station was empty save for a solitary figure at the far end, a man in a dark raincoat reading a newspaper, his face obscured by a fedora. A cliché, Elias told himself. A noir trope conjured by his sleep-deprived brain. He forced himself to walk past the man without looking, his boots echoing loudly on the wet concrete. He didn't look back to see if the man turned the page. The town center was a short walk up a steep, leaf-strewn hill. The main street was lined with boutique shops that capitalized on the Vance legacy: the Lark's Nest Cafe, Eleanor's Quill Stationery, the Vantage Point bookstore. Banners for the upcoming centenary gala hung limp and sodden from the lampposts, Eleanor's face fluttering in the wind, her eyes seeming to follow Elias as he hurried past. He wasn't here for the souvenirs. He was here for the county clerk's office, a squat, brick building that sat in the shadow of the imposing town hall. It was 8:05 a.m. The clerk, a woman with hair the color of steel wool and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, was just unlocking the front door. She eyed Elias with the suspicion reserved for strangers who arrived before the coffee was brewed. "We don't open until 9 for genealogy requests," she said, blocking the doorway with her body. "Please," Elias said, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "I'm not a tourist. I'm a researcher for the Heritage Foundation, doing some last-minute fact-checking for the gala." He flashed an old ID card from a library conference he'd attended 3 years ago. It was a weak lie, but the mention of the foundation worked like a charm. In Oakhaven, the foundation was the Vatican. The woman's posture softened. "Oh, well, come in then. Shame about the weather. You folks usually send someone in the summer." Inside, the office smelled of floor wax and old paper, a scent that usually calmed Elias, but today it made him nauseous. He bypassed the computer terminals. The digital records for the county had been sanitized years ago. Anything controversial regarding the Vances would have been scrubbed or sealed. He needed the basement. He needed the microfiches and the bound ledgers that hadn't seen the light of day since the Nixon administration. "I need birth records from 1948, Elias said, trying to keep his voice even. "And death certificates from the mid-70s. The clerk pointed him toward a row of metal filing cabinets in the back corner. "Help yourself. The microfiche reader is temperamental. You have to jiggle the knob." Elias spent the next hour in a trance of scrolling. The machine whirred and clicked, projecting negative images of handwritten birth logs onto a scratched glass screen. His eyes strained against the flickering light. "Valenti. Vance." He stopped. His breath hitched. August 12, 1948. Father, Arthur Vance. Mother, Lillian Vance. Child, Eleanor Marie Vance. Time, 4:02 a.m. He scrolled down a fraction of an inch. There it was. The line that history had forgotten. Child, Clara Jane Vance. Time: 4:14 a.m. Status: live birth. Twins. They were twins. Elias hit the print button. The machine groaned and spat out a damp, thermal copy of the record. He stared at it, the proof trembling in his hands. Eleanor wasn't an only child. She had a sister who had been erased so completely that even the town that worshipped the family seemed to have forgotten her. But a birth certificate only proved she existed. It didn't prove the abuse. It didn't prove the theft of the novel. For that, he needed to know how she died. He switched reels, moving forward in time to 1975. He spun the handle fast, the years blurring by Vietnam, Watergate, the moon landing, all reducing to streaks of light on the screen. He slowed down as he hit the verses for 1975. Vance, Clara Jane. Date of death, November 3rd, 1975. Place of death, St. Jude's Home for the Disturbed, Beacon, New York. Cause of death, asphyxiation, smoke inhalation. Notes: accidental fire in patient quarters. Elias froze. Fire. Clara had written, "Even if I have to burn this house down to do it, they will know." She had died in a fire. Or had she been burned to hide the evidence? And St. Jude's. He knew that name. It was a notorious sanitarium that had been shut down in the 80s amidst allegations of patient abuse and overcrowding. It was a dumping ground for the inconvenient relatives of the wealthy. He printed the death certificate. As the machine whirred, a shadow fell across the screen. Elias spun around. The clerk was standing there, holding a pot of coffee, but her expression was no longer friendly. She was looking at the screen at the name Clara Vance. "You're not from the Foundation," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I can explain." "The Foundation doesn't ask about Clara," she whispered, looking toward the front door as if expecting the walls to have ears. "Mr. Sterling made sure those files were supposed to be misplaced. I thought they were gone." Elias stepped closer. "You knew about her?" The old woman's eyes darted nervously. "Everyone in town knew back then, but we didn't talk about it. Mr. Arthur, the father, he said Clara was broken. Touched by the devil, the priest said. They sent her away when she was 12. Said it was for her own good. Then Eleanor got famous, and suddenly, Clara never existed." She gripped the coffee pot tight. "You should leave. If Sterling finds out you're digging this up." "Who is Sterling to you people?" Elias demanded. "He's just a fund director. He owns the debt on this town," she hissed. "He owns the mortgage on the library, the park, even this building. You leave. Now. Take your papers and go." Elias didn't argue. He grabbed the thermal prints, shoved them into his coat pocket, and bolted for the door. He emerged back into the rain, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had the beginning and the end. Born 1948, died 1975. But he needed the middle. He needed the link between the girl in the asylum and the manuscript of the Silent Lark. He needed to go to St. Jude's. Beacon was 2 towns over. Elias checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. The next train north wasn't for 40 minutes. He couldn't wait at the station. He felt too exposed. He decided to walk to the edge of town, to a diner he saw on his phone map, hoping to call a rideshare from there. As he walked down the hill, away from the manicured center of Oakhaven, the scenery shifted. The cute boutiques gave way to boarded-up storefronts and overgrown lots. This was the reality the gala banners tried to hide. He reached the Highway 9 diner, a chrome and neon relic that looked like it hadn't been renovated since The Silent Lark was published. He slid into a booth in the back, facing the door. He ordered a black coffee and pulled out his phone. He had 3 missed calls, all from an unknown number, and 1 voicemail. Elias held the phone to his ear. The voice was smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar. "Mr. Thorne, this is Marcus Sterling. My associates tell me you've closed your shop for the day. A sudden vacation? I hope you're not doing anything rash. Restoration is a delicate art. One slip of the hand, and something beautiful is ruined forever. Call me. We have a check waiting for you." Elias hung up, his hand shaking. Associates. He looked out the diner window. Across the street, In the parking lot of a closed gas station, a black sedan was parked. The engine was off, but the windows were tinted so dark they looked like voids. It was the same car from Brooklyn. They hadn't just followed him, they had tracked him. How? His phone? His credit card used for the train ticket? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He was an amateur playing a spy game. He needed to ditch his digital trail. He stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table, and walked toward the back of the diner. Restroom? He asked a waitress. Down the hall, out back, she grunted, not looking up from her notepad. Elias went down the narrow corridor, past the restrooms, and pushed open the heavy steel door labeled emergency exit. The alarm didn't sound. The wires had been cut or corroded years ago. He stepped out into an alleyway filled with dumpster bins and the smell of frying grease. He took his phone out. It was his lifeline, his map, his connection to the world. But it was also a beacon. He hesitated for a second, then threw the phone into an open dumpster filled with wet cardboard. He ran. He ran through the back streets of Oakhaven, splashing through puddles, heading toward the regional bus depot he had seen on the map before ditching the phone. A bus was anonymous. Cash only. 20 minutes later, Elias was sitting in the back of a Greyhound bus smelling of diesel and damp coats, heading toward Beacon. He was wet, shivering, and cut off from the world. But he had the papers in his pocket. The bus dropped him off on the outskirts of Beacon. St. Jude's Home for the Disturbed was no longer a hospital. According to his earlier research, the main building had been condemned, but the grounds were technically a public park, though rarely visited. The walk up the winding access road was grueling. The trees here were overgrown, their branches interlocking overhead to create a tunnel of gloom. The gates of St. Jude's loomed out of the mist, rusted iron wrought into twisting, thorny shapes. A sign hung askew, "No trespassing. State property." Elias slipped through a gap in the fence. The main building stood on a hill, a Victorian Gothic monstrosity of red brick and crumbling stone. The windows were boarded up, looking like blinded eyes. It was a place where hope went to die. He wasn't going inside the main building. It was too dangerous and likely gutted. He headed for the small cemetery at the edge of the woods, where the unclaimed patients were buried. The grass was waist-high. The grave markers were simple concrete blocks, mostly numbered, not named. This was how they erased people. Not with malice, but with bureaucratic indifference. Elias waded through the wet grass, counting the rows. He was looking for 1975. He found a section where the weeds had been recently disturbed. Someone had been here. Not a gardener. The cuts were rough, hacked away. He knelt before a small, moss-covered stone. It didn't have a number. It had a name, roughly chiseled by an amateur hand, perhaps a sympathetic nurse or a fellow patient. Clara. She sang. She sang, Elias whispered. The irony was heartbreaking. The mute girl who sang. He reached out to touch the stone. As he did, he noticed something tucked into the dirt at the base of the marker. A glass jar, half buried. Inside, sealed against the elements, was a notebook. A small, spiraled steno pad. Elias dug it out, his fingernails clawing at the mud. The lid was rusted shut. He smashed the jar against the side of the gravestone. The glass shattered. He pulled out the notebook. It was damp, but legible. He opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a manuscript. The first page read, "The Silent Lark," by Clara Vance. But as he flipped through the pages, he saw something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just the draft of the published book. The margins were filled with notes. October 1974, Eleanor visited today. She didn't ask about the book. She asked about the ending. She wants the lark to die. She says tragedy sells. I told her no. The lark flies away. The lark escapes. Elias flipped to the end of the notebook. The ending was different. In the published version, the version the world knew, the mute girl dies in the snow, a martyr for a cruel world. A tragic, beautiful death that won the Pulitzer. But in Clara's notebook, the girl survives. She finds a voice. She leaves the town. Eleanor hadn't just stolen the book, she had murdered the character. She had rewritten Clara's hope into despair to please the critics. A twig snapped behind him. Elias spun around, clutching the notebook to his chest. Standing at the edge of the tree line, 30 yards away, was the man in the raincoat. The fedora was gone. His head was shaved, and his face was a mask of indifference. He held a pistol by his side, fitted with a suppressor. "Mr. Thorne," the man called out. His voice carried effortlessly through the damp air. "You've been very busy." Elias scrambled backward, his boots slipping in the mud. He was trapped against the gravestones. "It's over," Elias shouted, holding up the notebook. "I have the original draft. The real ending." The man began to walk forward unhurried, stepping over the forgotten dead. "That's not the real ending, Elias. The real ending is the one the world believes. The one printed on 1,000,000 copies. Truth is just a consensus." He raised the gun. "Give me the book, and you can walk away. Keep it, and you stay here with her." Elias looked at the gun, then at the dense woods behind the cemetery. The drop-off beyond the tree line was steep, leading down to the river. "She didn't die in a fire, did she?" Elias yelled, desperate to buy time. The man paused. "Fire is a cleanser. It hides a multitude of sins." Eleanor was pragmatic. She couldn't have a sister disputing the authorship on the eve of the award ceremony. Murder. It wasn't just exploitation. It was fratricide. Elias didn't wait for the man to finish his thought. He turned and sprinted toward the woods. Phut! A bullet tore into the bark of the tree next to his head, showering him with splinters. Elias dove into the undergrowth, the thorns tearing at his coat. He scrambled down the embankment, sliding on wet leaves and mud. Another shot whizzed past his ear. He tumbled down the slope, hitting rocks and roots, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of green and gray. He grasped the notebook, so tight his knuckles turned white. He couldn't stop. He rolled onto a flat ledge of rock, gasping for air, his ribs screaming in pain. Below him, the Hudson River churned, gray and unforgiving. Above him, he heard the crunch of boots on the ridge. He had nowhere to go but down. Elias looked at the freezing water. He looked at the notebook. He shoved the notebook inside his coat, zipped it up to his chin, and took a breath. He jumped. The cold hit him like a hammer, stealing the air from his lungs. The current grabbed him, dragging him under, pulling him away from Oakhaven, away from the grave, and into the darkness of the river. As he fought to surface, gasping for a sliver of air, he saw the blurry figure on the cliff edge above, watching him drift away. Elias let the current take him. He was alive. He had the truth. And now he was a ghost, just like Clara. The Hudson River was not a body of water. It was a living, freezing entity that wanted to swallow Elias Thorne whole. It tasted of oil, silt, and the metallic tang of industrial decay. The current was a muscular force, dragging him south, tumbling him over submerged rocks that struck his knees and ribs with the force of hammers. His coat, heavy with water, had become a lead weight, an anchor trying to pull him down into the black silt of the riverbed. Elias gasped, his mouth filling with brackish water, and kicked. He kicked with the desperate, flailing instinct of a dying animal. His boots were gone, lost somewhere in the initial plunge, and his numbed toes scraped against jagged river stones. Above him, the sky was a bruised purple bruise of twilight, indifferent to his struggle. He wasn't thinking about the notebook. He wasn't thinking about Eleanor Vance. He was thinking about air. Just one more lungful. His hand struck something solid, a slimy, rot-softened log protruding from the mudbank. He clawed at it, his fingernails digging into the decaying wood, and hauled himself up. The river fought him, sucking at his legs, reluctant to let its prize go, but Elias groaned, a guttural, primal sound, and dragged his body onto the shore. He collapsed into the mud, heaving. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. He coughed, retching up river water, his entire body convulsing with shivers so violent his teeth clacked together like dice in a cup. He lay there for a minute, maybe 10, staring at the tangled roots of a sycamore tree that loomed over the bank like a skeletal hand. "Get up." The voice in his head was faint, drowned out by the roar of blood in his ears. If you stay here, you die. Elias rolled onto his back. His hand flew to his chest. The coat. The zipper. With trembling fingers that felt like frozen sausages, he fumbled with the zipper of his sodden wool coat. It was jammed with grit. He yanked it down, tearing the fabric. He reached inside, past the soaked layers of his shirt, to the inner pocket. The notebook. He pulled it out. It was a sodden brick. The cheap spiral-bound paper had absorbed water like a sponge. It was heavy, dark, and terrifyingly fragile. Elias stared at it in horror. Ink was water-soluble. If the words Clara Vance had written 50 years ago had washed away in the Hudson, he had jumped off a cliff for nothing. He had died for nothing. He couldn't check it here. The rain was still falling, a light, freezing drizzle that glazed the mud. He needed shelter. He needed heat. He staggered to his feet, swaying like a drunkard. The riverbank was lined with dense brush, but through the skeletal trees, he saw a shape. A roofline. Sharp angles against the gray sky. Elias began to walk. Every step was agony. His socks were shredded, his feet bleeding, but the numbness of hypothermia was starting to set in, a dangerous, seductive warmth that promised sleep if he just lay down. He fought it. He focused on the shape ahead. It was a boathouse. A relic of the Gilded Age, built of dark timber and stone, perched at the edge of a private dock that had long since collapsed into the water. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, the wood weathered to silver gray. Elias reached the heavy wooden door. Locked. Of course. He circled the structure, his breath misting in the air. Around the back, facing the woods, there was a small window, high up. The glass was caked with grime. Elias searched the ground until he found a fist-sized rock. He wrapped his hand in the wet sleeve of his coat and struck the pane. Crack. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet woods. He struck again. The glass shattered inward. He cleared the jagged shards from the frame and hoisted himself up. It was a clumsy, painful entry. He tumbled inside, landing hard on a wooden floor that smelled of gasoline, old canvas, and dry rot. It was pitch black inside, save for the gray light filtering through the broken window. Elias lay on the floor for a moment, listening. Silence. No alarm. No dogs. Just the wind whistling through the hole he'd made. He forced himself up. He was in a storage room. He felt his way along the wall until he found a door. It opened into a larger space, the main boat bay. A dusty tarp covered a small motorboat in the center. But Elias didn't care about the boat. He cared about the cast-iron wood stove in the corner. It was cold, obviously, but next to it was a stack of dry firewood and a box of kindling. Elias felt his knees before the stove. He opened the iron door. He needed a spark. His lighter was in his pants pocket. He fished it out. A cheap plastic bodega lighter. He flicked it. Nothing. Just a spark. The flint was wet. "Come on," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Come on." He rolled the mechanism against his jeans, trying to dry it. He blew on it. He flicked it again. A tiny, pathetic flame sputtered and died. He tried again. And again. On the 10th try, the flame held. Elias shoved a handful of old newspaper from the wood box into the stove and touched the flame to it. The paper caught. He added kindling, watching with obsessive intensity as the fire licked at the dry wood. When the first log caught, the crackle of the wood sounded like a choir of angels. He stripped. Every layer of wet clothing peeled away was a victory. He hung his coat and shirt on the back of an old wooden chair, dragging it close to the stove. He stood there, naked and shivering, the heat radiating against his skin, turning the numbness into a prickly, stinging pain. But he couldn't rest. The notebook. Elias brought the sodden mass of paper to the stove. He couldn't put it too close. Heat would warp the paper and fade the ink. He needed to be a surgeon again. He found a roll of shop towels on a workbench. They were greasy but absorbent. He tore off sheets and carefully, agonizingly, began to interleave them between the pages of the notebook. The paper was so soft it felt like wet tissue. If he pulled too hard, the page would disintegrate. He had to lift each corner with the tip of his fingernail, slide the towel in, and press down gently. Page 1. The Silent Lark. The ink had bled, creating a halo around the letters, but it was still legible. Ballpoint pen. Thank God for cheap, oil-based ballpoint ink. If she had used a fountain pen, the words would be gone. Page 2. Page 3. He worked in a trance, the heat from the stove drying the sweat on his brow. The hours passed. The storm outside battered the boathouse, but inside, in the circle of firelight, Elias was resurrecting the dead. 100 miles south, in a penthouse office overlooking Central Park, the atmosphere was temperature-controlled and sterile. Marcus Sterling stood by the window, swirling a glass of 25-year-old scotch. The city lights below were a grid of diamonds, a world of order and power that he had spent his life curating. His phone buzzed on the glass desk. He didn't turn around. He pressed the speaker button. "Report," he said. The voice on the other end was distorted, flat. It was the man in the raincoat. He went into the river. North of the Beacon Cliffs. The current is strong there. Class 4 rapids downstream due to the storm. "Did you see the body?" Marcus asked, taking a sip of scotch. "I saw him go under. He didn't come up. I tracked the riverbank for 2 miles. No sign. If the impact didn't kill him, the hypothermia did within minutes. And the item? With him. At the bottom of the Hudson." Marcus paused. He looked at his reflection in the window, gray hair, tailored suit, the face of a man who was the custodian of American culture. Certainty is a luxury, Silas. But probability is an acceptable substitute. Maintain a presence in Oak Haven for 24 hours. If he washes up, I want to know before the police do. Understood. The line clicked dead. Marcus finished his drink. He walked over to a glass display case on his wall. Inside, illuminated by a spotlight, was a typewriter, an old Remington. The typewriter Eleanor Vance had supposedly used to write The Silent Lark. Marcus touched the glass. "Rest easy, Auntie," he whispered. "The pest control is finished." Back in the boathouse, Elias was not dead. He was warm. He was dressed in a pair of oil-stained coveralls he had found hanging on a nail, and he was reading. The notebook was drying. The pages were crinkled, swollen to twice their original thickness, smelling of river water and wood smoke, but they were readable. And what Elias was reading was shattering his understanding of the world. He had expected a draft. He had expected a different ending. He had found those. But as he reached the back of the notebook, the narrative stopped. The handwriting changed. It became smaller, tighter, the writing of someone trying to conserve paper, or perhaps someone writing in a hurry. It was a log. A record of visitors. November 1st, 1975. The man in the gray suit came back. The lawyer. Mr. Sterling. He brought the papers for Eleanor to sign. I heard them arguing through the vent. Elias froze. Mr. Sterling. Marcus? No, Marcus would have been a child in 1975. This was his father. Arthur Sterling. The founder of the firm that represented the Vance estate. He read on. Eleanor was crying. She said, "I can't do it. I can't let her rot in there forever." Mr. Sterling laughed. It sounded like dry leaves. He said, "My dear, the Pulitzer Committee has already made their decision based on the manuscript. But they require a clean narrative. A mute genius sister is a compelling backstory. A living, insane sister claiming ownership is a scandal. We are building a monument, Eleanor. You don't build a monument on shifting sand. They are selling me. I am not a sister anymore. I am a liability." Sterling said he knows a place. St. Jude's. He knows the director. He said, for a donation, they can ensure she is comfortable and quiet. Eleanor signed. I heard the pen scratch against the paper. I am sold for a prize. Elias lowered the notebook. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. It wasn't just plagiarism. It was human trafficking. Arthur Sterling had brokered the deal to institutionalize Clara to protect the intellectual property that would become the foundation of his law firm's wealth. The Heritage Foundation wasn't just preserving a legacy, it was laundering the guilt of 2 families. Marcus Sterling wasn't just protecting a dead author, he was protecting his father's crimes. Elias turned the page. The last entry. November 3rd. I smell smoke. The nurse. The one with the scar. She left a box of matches on my bed. She smiled and left the door unlocked. But the window is barred. Why leave the door unlocked if the hallway is blocked? I understand now. They aren't going to keep me quiet. They're going to let me do it to myself. They want me to be the tragedy. But I won't burn alone. I will leave this. Someone will find it. The gardener, Thomas. He looks at me with kindness. I will bury it by the stone. My name is Clara Vance. I wrote the lark. I am the lark. And I am about to fly. The writing trailed off into a jagged line. Elias closed the notebook. He felt a heavy, cold stone settle in his gut. This was why Marcus had offered $500,000. This was why they had burned his shop. It wasn't about literary reputation. It was about murder charges. Conspiracy. The complete destruction of the Sterling Empire. He looked around the boathouse. He was safe for the moment, but he was trapped. He had no phone, no money, no car. And the most powerful men in New York thought he was dead. That was his only advantage. He needed to get back to the city. He needed to get this notebook not to the police. Sterling owned the police, or at least enough of them to make evidence disappear, but to the public. He needed a stage. The gala. The Centenary Gala was in 2 days. At the Plaza Hotel. Every major news outlet, every literary critic, every camera would be there. It was the only place where the light would be too bright for Sterling to hide in the shadows. But how to get there? He was a fugitive in coveralls, barefoot, 80 miles from Manhattan. Elias stood up. He walked to the workbench and began rummaging through the drawers. He found a roll of duct tape, a rusty screwdriver, and a box of fishing tackle. He looked at the boat under the tarp. It was an old outboard runabout. He checked the fuel tank. Half full. The river was dangerous. The cleaner had said so. Class 4 rapids. Debris. Darkness. But the river was also a highway. A highway that didn't have cameras, didn't have tolls, and didn't have checkpoints. Elias grabbed the duct tape. He began to wrap his feet, creating makeshift soles to protect his cuts. He put on the oversized canvas jacket hanging by the door. He carefully wrapped the dry notebook in 3 layers of plastic shopping bags he found under the sink, sealing it with tape until it was a waterproof brick. He strapped it to his body, tight against his ribs. He walked to the boat and pulled the tarp off. He dragged the boat toward the water, the hull scraping loudly against the wood. He opened the bay doors. The wind held in, blowing rain into his face. The river was a churning black void, angry and loud. Elias looked at the water. He was terrified. He was a book restorer, a man who spent his life in quiet rooms with dead paper. He wasn't an action hero, but he remembered the line in the notebook, "I am the lark. And I am about to fly." "For Clara," he whispered. He pushed the boat into the water. He jumped in, the cold spray soaking him instantly. He yanked the starter cord. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "Please," Elias begged. He pulled again. And again. On the 4th pull, the engine roared to life, a jagged, mechanical scream that cut through the storm. Elias steered the boat away from the dock, turning the bow south, toward the lights of the city that were invisible behind the curve of the earth. He gummed the throttle, and the small boat surged forward, bouncing violently over the waves, disappearing into the throat of the night. The Hudson River was a dark, heaving beast that seemed intent on digesting Elias Thorne. The small outboard motor screamed against the roar of the storm, a mechanical banshee fighting a losing battle against the churning black water. Every wave was a sledgehammer, slamming into the fiberglass hull with a violence that rattled Elias's teeth and sent shockwaves through his bruised ribs. He was no longer a man. He was a frozen nerve ending gripping the tiller, his knuckles white, his eyes squinting against the stinging needles of freezing rain. The duct tape around his feet had soaked through hours ago, leaving his skin numb and raw, but he couldn't feel his feet anymore. He couldn't feel anything except the burning heat of the notebook strapped to his chest, a phantom warmth that pulsed in time with his terrified heart. He steered by instinct and terror. The river was a chaotic graveyard of storm debris. Massive logs, ripped from the banks upstream, bobbed in the troughs of the waves like torpedoes, appearing out of the darkness only seconds before impact. Elias swerved, the boat listing dangerously, the gunwale dipping below the waterline and taking on gallons of icy sludge. He bailed with a plastic bucket he'd found under the seat, steering with one hand, bailing with the other, a rhythmic, frantic dance of survival. He was talking to himself, or perhaps he was talking to Clara. "Not yet," he gasped, spitting out river water that tasted of diesel and decay. "We don't sink yet. We fly. You said we fly." The hours blurred into a singular, gray nightmare. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the fuel gauge's needle inching toward the ready. The solitude was absolute. To the left, the dark cliffs of the Palisades loomed like the walls of a fortress. To the right, the train tracks he had ridden north just that morning were invisible in the gloom. He was a ghost ship in the artery of America, bypassing the checkpoints, the cameras, and the men in raincoats who were currently dredging the river bottom 20 miles upstream. They were looking for a corpse. They wouldn't be looking for a madman in a stolen boat riding the storm surge into the heart of the city. Then he saw it. The George Washington Bridge. It emerged from the mist like a crown of thorns suspended in the sky, its lights a string of diamonds hanging over the abyss. To a commuter, it was traffic. To Elias, it was the gate to hell. The city. The wind howled through the suspension cables, a mournful song that vibrated in his chest. As he passed under the massive steel span, the water grew choppier, churned by the conflicting currents of the Harlem River and the Hudson. The boat engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Silence, sudden and terrifying, rushed in to fill the void, broken only by the slap of water against the hull. "No, no, no," Elias pleaded, yanking the starter cord. His shoulder screamed in protest. The engine wheezed, but didn't catch. He was drifting now, the current spinning the small boat in lazy, nauseating circles, pushing him toward the rotting pilings of the Manhattan shoreline. He grabbed the solitary oar from the floorboards. It was splintered and short, but it was all he had. He paddled, his muscles burning with lactic acid, fighting the river that wanted to sweep him out into the harbor and lost to the Atlantic. He aimed for a patch of darkness between two crumbling piers near 125th Street, a graveyard of industrial skeletons where the city turned its back on the water. The boat scraped against concrete with a sound like a shriek. Elias threw the rope around a rusted rebar spike and hauled himself up onto the pier. The ground was slick with oil and rain, but it was solid. He didn't look back at the boat. He let the rope go. He watched as the current caught the small vessel, banging it against the pilings until it took on too much water and slipped beneath the surface, a silent burial for the vehicle of his resurrection. He was ashore. Manhattan at 4 a.m. was a different planet than the glittering metropolis shown in travel brochures. This was the city's underbelly, a world of steam venting from manhole covers, garbage trucks grinding their gears like prehistoric beasts, and the scurrying of rats that owned the streets before dawn. Elias walked. He had to keep moving to keep his blood circulating. He looked like a creature from a horror film, his face smeared with mud and dried blood, wearing oversized, oil-stained coveralls that hung off his frame, his feet wrapped in silver duct tape that slapped wetly against the pavement. A police cruiser rolled past slowly on Riverside Drive. Elias didn't run. He hunched his shoulders, shuffling with the limp of the invisible, the homeless, the addicted. The cop didn't even turn his head. In New York, misery was the best camouflage. He needed a sanctuary. He couldn't go to his apartment. It was a charred ruin. He couldn't go to his shop. It was a crime scene. He couldn't go to a hotel. He had no money and looked like a vagrant. He needed the one person in the city who hated Marcus Sterling as much as he did, the one person who knew the secrets of the book trade better than the Heritage Foundation. He needed Saul Rourke. Saul was a legend and a cautionary tale. Once the head archivist for the New York Public Library, he had been disgraced a decade ago in a scandal involving the theft of rare maps. A scandal that Elias knew had been orchestrated by the Sterling family to cover their own acquisitions of stolen goods. Saul now lived and worked in a basement in Hell's Kitchen, running an off-the-books bindery that catered to private collectors who didn't ask questions about provenance. He was a pariah, a drunk, and a genius. The walk to Hell's Kitchen took 2 hours. By the time Elias reached the nondescript metal door in the alleyway off 9th Avenue, the sky was lightening to a bruised purple. He hammered on the door. Nothing. He hammered again, picking up a discarded brick and banging it against the steel until his arm shook. "Go away or I'll shoot you through the door," a voice rasped from the inside. It sounded like gravel in a blender. "Saul, it's Elias. Elias Thorne." Silence. Then, the sound of heavy deadbolts sliding back. 1, 2, 3. The door creaked open a crack, held by a heavy chain. A bloodshot eye peered out from the gloom, framed by a shock of wild white hair. "Thorne?" The eye widened. "You're dead. I saw it on the news. Fire at your place. Missing person. They said you fried." "I'm not dead, Saul. But I will be if you don't let me in." The chain rattled. The door swung open. Elias stumbled inside, the smell of the room hitting him like a physical blow, a potent mix of cigar smoke, stale whiskey, chemical solvents, and cat litter. It was a cluttered cavern, shelves stacked floor to ceiling with books, tools, and papers, illuminated by the yellow glow of vintage desk lamps. Saul Rourke stood in a stained bathrobe, holding a revolver in one hand and a lit cigar in the other. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the duct-taped feet, the bloody forehead, the shivering frame. "You look like shit, kid," Saul grunted, engaging the safety on the gun and tossing it onto a pile of leather scraps. "You look like you swam here from Jersey." "I did," Elias whispered. He collapsed into a worn leather armchair, his legs finally giving out. I need whiskey. And scissors." Saul poured 3 fingers of amber liquid into a dirty tumbler and handed it to Elias. Elias downed it in one go, the alcohol burning a path through the cold in his chest. He gasped, the warmth spreading to his fingertips. "Scissors?" Saul asked, raising an eyebrow. Elias unzipped the coveralls. He began to peel away the layers of plastic bags taped to his torso. The sound of the tape ripping was loud in the quiet room. Saul watched, his cynical eyes narrowing. He knew that sound. That was the sound of contraband. Elias pulled out the notebook. It was swollen, the pages wavy, but it was intact. He placed it on Saul's workbench, right next to a half-restored Gutenberg Bible that was almost certainly stolen. "What is that?" Saul asked, leaning in, his professional curiosity overriding his hangover. "The end of the Sterling Empire," Elias said. "It's Clara Vance. The real one." Saul's hand hovered over the notebook. He didn't touch it. He looked at Elias, his face losing its drunken slackness. "Clara? The ghost sister? That's a myth, Elias. A campfire story for grad students." "Read the last page," Elias challenged. Saul put on a pair of jeweler's loupe glasses. He opened the notebook with the reverence of a priest handling the Eucharist. He read the entry about the fire. He read the entry about the sale of her life to St. Jude's. He read the name of Arthur Sterling. When Saul looked up, his face was pale. He took a long drag of his cigar, his hand trembling slightly. "Arthur Sterling. That son of a bitch. I knew he was crooked, but this is blood money. This is the foundation of the entire modern canon." He looked at Elias. "Marcus knows you have this? He sent a cleaner to kill me. In Oak Haven. I went off a cliff." Saul let out a low whistle. "So you're a ghost. And ghosts are dangerous because they have nothing left to lose." He closed the notebook gently. "What do you want to do? Sell it? I know a guy in Tokyo who would pay 10 million for this, no questions asked. You could disappear. Live on a beach." "No," Elias said, his voice hardening. "I don't want money. I want them to see her. I want to burn it down. The gala is tonight." Saul stared at him, then a slow, jagged grin spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. It was a smile of pure, anarchic vindication. "The gala. The plaza. Marcus is going to announce the Centenary Fund tonight. He's going to be live on every network." "I need to get in," Elias said. "I need a suit. I need a haircut. And I need a way past security." Saul stubbed out his cigar. "Security at the plaza for an event like this is tight. Metal detectors. List checkers. But..." He walked over to a filing cabinet and yanked open a drawer. He rummaged through a stack of papers and pulled out a laminated batch. I still have some friends in the trade. The union printers. They're doing the programs for the event. This is a press pass for a photographer from the Literary Review. The guy who was supposed to go is currently in a detox tank in Queens thanks to a bottle of bad gin I sent him yesterday. He won't be using it. He tossed the badge to Elias. You don't look like him, but nobody looks at the photo. They look at the lanyard and the confidence. Saul walked to a wardrobe in the corner. He pulled out a tuxedo. It was vintage, midnight blue, with a shawl collar. It's mine. From the old days. Before they kicked me out. It smells like mothballs and regret, but it fits a man of your build. Elias stood up. He felt the adrenaline returning, sharpening his senses. Thank you, Saul. Don't thank me yet, Saul muttered, grabbing a pair of shears and a razor. Sit down. You look like a yeti. If you're going to crash a party, you need to look like you own the place. For the next hour, the basement became a transformation chamber. Saul cut Elias's hair, shearing away the matted, river-soaked locks into a sharp, classic style. He lathered Elias's face and shaved him with a straight razor, the blade gliding over the skin with terrifying proximity. When the razor passed over the fresh cut on Elias's forehead, the souvenir from the fire, Saul didn't cover it. Leave the scar, Saul said, wiping the blade. It gives you character. Makes you look like you've seen the devil and lived. Elias dressed. The tuxedo was tight in the shoulders, but tailored in the waist. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror. The man staring back wasn't the quiet book restorer from Brooklyn. He was harder. His eyes were dark hollows of determination. The scar on his forehead was a jagged line of red against his pale skin. He looked like a man who had walked out of a grave. He taped the notebook back to his chest, but this time, he didn't use plastic bags. He placed it inside the interior pocket of the tuxedo jacket, right over his heart. It created a slight bulge, but in the dim light of a ballroom, no one would notice. You have a plan for when you get on stage? Saul asked, handing him a pair of polished Oxfords. I'm going to read, Elias said. I'm going to let Clara speak. Saul nodded. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, silver flask. Take this. Dutch courage. You're going to need it. Elias pocketed the flask. I have to go. The pre-show cocktail hour starts at 6. Saul opened the heavy steel door. The afternoon sun sliced into the gloom. Give hell, kid. For Clara. And for me. Uptown, in the presidential suite of the Plaza Hotel, the air smelled of fresh lilies and expensive cologne. Marcus Sterling stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his bow tie. It was a perfect knot. Everything about Marcus was perfect. Behind him, on the velvet sofa, sat the cleaner Silas. He looked out of place in the opulent room, like a stain on a silk sheet. The river patrol found the boat, Silas said, his voice devoid of inflection. Scuttled near 125th Street. No body. Marcus froze. His hands hovered over his tie. He watched Silas in the reflection of the mirror. No body? The current could have taken him out to sea, or stuck him under a pier. But there is no corpse. Marcus turned around slowly. The calmness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something reptilian. You told me the probability was absolute. Nature is variable, Silas said. But he has no resources. No allies. If he is alive, he is a fugitive. He can't come here. We have facial recognition at the guest entrances. We have private security at the service doors. Marcus walked to the window, looking down at the fountain in front of the hotel. Limousines were already lining up, discharging women in glittering gowns and men who controlled the GDP of small nations. This was his night. The culmination of 50 years of brand management. The Eleanor Vance centenary was set to raise $200 million for the foundation, money that Marcus controlled. I don't like loose ends, Silas, Marcus said softly. Double the security on the stage perimeter. Tell them to look for a vagrant. A man who looks like he's been sleeping in a park. If you see him, don't arrest him. Take him to the loading dock and finish it. Understood. Silas stood up and left the room. Marcus turned back to the mirror. He smoothed his gray hair. He practiced his smile, warm, benevolent, the smile of a guardian of culture. He's dead, Marcus assured himself. He has to be. Nobody survives the fall and the river. He picked up the first edition of the Silent Lark from the table. It wasn't the one Elias had been restoring. That one was still in the shop, or so he thought. This was a display copy. A prop. To history, he toasted to the empty room. And to the victors who write it. Elias Thorne stepped out of a taxi on 58th Street, a block away from the plaza. He didn't have the invitation that the doormen were checking. He had the press pass dangling from his neck, and he had the camera bag Saul had given him, empty, except for a heavy wrench he had taken from the basement, just in case. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glistening. The air was crisp. Elias walked toward the side entrance designated for press and staff. His heart hammered against the notebook in his pocket. Thump thump. Thump thump. It felt like Clara was knocking, asking to be let out. He approached the security checkpoint. A large man with an earpiece held up a hand. ID and credentials, the guard grunted. Elias held up the badge. He didn't speak. He channeled the arrogance Saul had told him to wear. He looked bored. He looked like a man who hated these events. The guard scanned the badge. The little light on his reader turned green. He looked at Elias's face, then at the photo on the badge, a blurry image of a bearded man. Elias had shaved, but the resemblance was passable if you didn't care. Bag check, the guard said, pointing to the X-ray machine. Elias froze. The wrench. Camera equipment, Elias said smoothly. Lenses are fragile. Hand check only, please. The guard sighed, annoyed. Open it. Elias unzipped the bag. The guard glanced inside, seeing the black foam padding and the shape of a telephoto lens, which was actually a thermos painted black that Saul had thrown in. He didn't dig deep enough to feel the cold steel of the wrench beneath the foam. Go ahead, the guard waved him through. Elias walked through the metal detector. He held his breath. The notebook had a metal spiral binding. Beep. The guard looked up. Belt buckle, Elias said, tapping his waist. Vintage. The guard waved a handheld wand over him. It beeped at his waist. Then at his chest. Elias's blood ran cold. The notebook. Microphone, Elias said quickly, tapping his lapel. For the dictaphone. I record my notes. The guard paused. He looked at Elias's tuxedo. He looked at the scar on his forehead. You got into a fight with a cat? The guard asked, pointing to the cut. Deadline, Elias deadpanned. Editor threw a stapler. The guard chuckled. It was a joke, he understood. All right. Go on. Don't block the aisle. Elias stepped through. He was in. The bowels of the plaza were a hive of activity. Waiters in white jackets rushed by with trays of champagne. Technicians coiled cables. Elias navigated the corridors, following the signs for the grand ballroom, backstage. He didn't go to the press pit. That was a cage. He needed to be closer. He needed to be where the actors were. He found a darkened alcove behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage left wing. From here, he could see the entire ballroom. It was a canyon of gold leaf and crystal. Chandelier light refracted off diamonds and silverware. The murmuring of 1,000 wealthy people created a low, oceanic roar. And there, in the center of the room, sat Marcus Sterling, shaking hands with the mayor of New York. He looked like a king holding court. Elias gripped the velvet curtain. His hand brushed against his chest pocket. Soon, he whispered. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. A heavy iron grip. You're not on the roster for this sector, a voice growled in his ear. Elias stiffened. He didn't turn around. He knew that voice. It was the voice from the cemetery. The cleaner. Silas. Turn around slowly, Silas whispered. And don't make a scene, or I will break your spine right here. Elias turned. Silas was standing there, dressed in a tuxedo, looking like just another guest, but his eyes were dead sharks. He recognized Elias instantly, despite the haircut and the shave. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his face. You, Silas breathed. You possess a cockroach's resilience. I'm hard to kill, Elias said, his muscles coiling. We'll see about that. Walk. Toward the exit. Now. Silas pressed something hard against Elias's ribs. A gun? A knife? In this crowd? Elias looked at the stage. The lights were dimming. The orchestra was striking up the opening notes of the anthem. Marcus was standing up, adjusting his jacket, preparing to ascend the stairs to the podium. It was now or never. Elias looked Silas in the eye. I'm not walking out. You don't have a choice. I always have a choice, Elias said. And then Elias did the only thing Silas didn't expect. He didn't fight back. He didn't run away. He screamed. Fire! Fire backstage! The scream tore through the hush of the ballroom like a grenade. The scream tore through the hush of the grand ballroom like a jagged piece of shrapnel. Fire! Fire backstage! It was a primal sound, a desperate fabrication born of survival instinct. But in a room packed with New York's elite, panic was a contagion that moved faster than any flame. For a split second, the orchestra faltered, a violinist's bow screeching off-key. Heads turned, necks craning, diamonds flashing as the collective organism of the crowd recoiled. Silas, the cleaner, flinched. It was a microscopic reaction, a momentary lapse in his predatory focus as his eyes darted toward the velvet curtains to assess the threat. That fraction of a second was all Elias Thorne needed. He didn't pull away, he twisted his body, dropping his center of gravity and driving his shoulder into Silas's solar plexus. The hit wasn't graceful, it was the clumsy, desperate shove of a man who had spent his life lifting heavy boxes of paper, not fighting assassins, but it was enough. Silas stumbled back, his grip breaking. Elias didn't look back. He didn't run toward the exit signs that were now flickering in his peripheral vision. He ran toward the light. He vaulted over a monitor wedge, his dress shoes slipping on the polished cables. The stage was only 10 yards away, but it felt like a mile across a minefield. Security guards, confused by the shout of fire but trained to protect the asset, were looking in the wrong direction, scanning the wings for smoke. By the time they registered the man in the tuxedo sprinting toward the guest of honor, Elias was already taking the stairs 2 at a time. Marcus Sterling was frozen at the podium. He had been mid-breath, about to launch into his rehearsed anecdote about Eleanor Vance's love for gardening. He saw the movement in his periphery, a blur of black and white rushing him. His first thought wasn't fear, it was indignation. Who is ruining my broadcast? Then he saw the face. He saw the scar on the forehead, angry and red. He saw the eyes, wild and burning with a terrifying clarity. He saw the ghost he thought was rotting at the bottom of the Hudson River. No, Marcus whispered, the word lost in the sudden rising murmur of the crowd. Elias hit the center stage. He didn't attack Marcus. He attacked the microphone. He grabbed the stand with both hands, his momentum nearly toppling it. The feedback shrieked, a high-pitched electronic wail that caused 300 people to cover their ears simultaneously. It was the sound of the system breaking. Stop him! Marcus roared, his composure shattering. Security! He's a lunatic. 2 large men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the stage right wing, moving with the speed of linebackers. Elias saw them coming. He knew he had 5 seconds. Maybe less. He jammed his hand into his interior pocket, ripping the duct tape that held the notebook closed, and pulled out the water-swollen, yellowed block of paper. He held it up like a shield, like a weapon, like a holy relic. Don't look at me! Elias screamed, his voice amplified by the PA system, booming over the confusion, bouncing off the gold leaf ceiling. Look at this. The security guards were 10 feet away. 5 feet. This is the hand of Clara Vance. Elias bellowed. The name acted like a tripwire. In the front row, an elderly woman in a wheelchair gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The security guards hesitated. They didn't know why they hesitated, only that the man wasn't holding a gun, and he was screaming a name that sounded like a secret. Marcus lunged. He abandoned his podium, his dignity, and his script. He threw himself at Elias, his manicured hands clawing for the notebook. Give me that. You thief. You filth. Elias spun away, shielding the book with his body. He elbowed Marcus back, a sharp, hard blow that sent the older man stumbling against the podium. The microphone stand wobbled, but stayed upright. Elias grabbed it again, leaning in so close his lips brushed the metal grill. "They told you Eleanor Vance was a genius," Elias panted, his breath rasping through the speakers, every heavy inhalation heard by millions watching the live stream. "They told you she lived alone." They lied. The ballroom had gone silent. The panic about the fire had evaporated, replaced by a voyeuristic, paralyzed tension. This was unscripted. This was a car crash happening on a stage of velvet and flowers. "This is not a prop," Elias shouted, shaking the notebook. Debris and dried river mud flaked off it, drifting down onto the pristine stage floor. "This is a diary, written in 1974, by the sister Marcus Sterling's father erased from the world. Her name was Clara, and she wrote the Silent Lark in a basement while Eleanor Vance took the credit." "Cut the feed," Marcus screamed at the sound booth, his face purple with rage. "Cut the damn audio." But the technicians were frozen. The director in the booth was staring at the monitors, watching the ratings spike vertically. Nobody moved a finger. "He's mentally ill," Marcus yelled to the crowd, straightening his tie, trying to regain the narrative. "This man is a stalker. He's been harassing the foundation for weeks. He's dangerous. Get him off the stage." The security guards stepped forward again, their uncertainty fading under the direct order. One of them reached for Elias's arm. Elias didn't fight the grip. He just opened the book. He found the page he had memorized in the boathouse, the page that burned in his mind. October 14th, 1973. Elias read, his voice dropping an octave, becoming steady solemn. The sheer change in his tone stopped the guard. It wasn't the voice of a maniac, it was the voice of a narrator. "I am the shadow, and she is the thief of light. Eleanor locks the door, but she cannot lock my mind. The lark is not a bird. The lark is the sound of my own silence breaking." A ripple went through the crowd. They knew those words. Every person in that room who considered themselves literate knew a variation of those words. The lark is the sound of silence breaking. It was the most famous line in the novel. But in the published book, it was different. In the book, it was, "The lark is the hope of silence breaking." "She changed it," Elias said, looking directly into the camera lens, ignoring the guard who still held his arm. "Eleanor changed it because she didn't understand it. She smoothed it out. But Clara wrote it first. And Clara wrote this." He flipped to the back of the book, the wet pages tearing slightly. November 3rd. "The nurse left the matches. They want me to burn. They want the problem to go away. But I will not burn alone." Elias looked at Marcus. The tycoon was standing still now, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond reputation. He was looking at the ruin of his life. Arthur Sterling signed the papers to commit her to St. Jude's Asylum 2 days before the manuscript was sent to the publisher, Elias said, the facts acting as nails in a coffin. He sold a human being to protect a copyright. And his son. Elias pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. "His son tried to kill me to keep it buried." "Lies," Marcus shrieked. "All of it. It's a forgery." From the shadows of the wings, Silas moved. He had seen the guards hesitate. He had seen the crowd turning. He knew that the only way to stop this infection was to cut out the source. He reached into his tuxedo jacket. He didn't care about the cameras anymore. He cared about the clean slate. He gripped the handle of the suppressed pistol. Elias saw the movement. He saw the glint of metal in the stage lights. He braced himself, clutching the notebook to his chest, knowing he couldn't dodge a bullet from this range. "He's telling the truth." The voice was frail, quavering, but it cut through the air with the authority of a thunderclap. It didn't come from the stage. It came from the floor. Silas froze, his hand half drawn. The security guards let go of Elias. Marcus turned, his face draining of blood. At the base of the stage stairs, an electric wheelchair whirred forward. Margaret, the 90-year-old housekeeper, the last living link to the Vance household, was gripping the armrests of her chair with knobby, arthritic hands. She was weeping, but her head was held high. A young waiter had brought a handheld microphone to her, perhaps thinking she wanted to condemn the intruder. She did not. "Margaret," Marcus warned, his voice low and venomous. "Don't. Think about your pension. Think about your family." Margaret looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen 50 years of silence. "My family is dead, Marcus. And I am tired of carrying your ghosts." She turned her wheelchair to face the audience. The cameras swiveled, framing her wrinkled face on the giant screens behind the stage, dwarfing the two men. "I was there," Margaret said, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "I was the one who brought the soup to the basement. I saw Clara writing. I saw the ink on her fingers." She looked up at Elias, tears streaming down her face. "I saw Eleanor take the pages upstairs and type them out on her Remington." She used to laugh. She said, "Clara doesn't need the fame, Margaret. She lives in a world we can't touch. I'm doing her a favor." A gasp, loud and collective, sucked the air out of the room. This wasn't a crazy man with a muddy book. This was the beloved Margaret, the woman who had been featured in every documentary as the loyal servant. "I stole that page," Margaret continued, pointing to the yellow sheet Elias had first found. "The one in the binding. I put it there. I hoped that one day someone with good eyes would find it. I just didn't think it would take 50 years. She looked at Elias. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing her back." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of an empire collapsing. Marcus Sterling looked at the crowd. He saw the shock, the disgust, the phones raised to capture his demise. He looked at the exit. He looked at Silas. Silas was gone. The empty space in the wings where the killer had stood was the final verdict. The rat had fled the sinking ship. Marcus slumped against the podium. The arrogance, the polish, the veneer of the philanthropist, it all slid off him like oil. He looked old. He looked small. It was necessary, Marcus mumbled into the live mic, unaware he was still broadcasting. The art. The art was what mattered. Who cares where it came from? We do, Elias said. He stepped back from the microphone. He didn't need to say anything else. He carefully closed the notebook. He walked down the stairs, past the stunned security guards who parted like the Red Sea. He walked to Margaret. He knelt beside her wheelchair and placed the sodden, muddy notebook in her lap. "It belongs to you," Elias said softly. "You kept her alive." Margaret placed her hand over the book, sobbing quietly. Flashbulbs began to pop. 1, then 10, then a blinding storm of white light. The spell of silence broke, replaced by the roar of questions, the shouting of reporters, the chaos of history being rewritten in real time. Police officers were entering the back of the ballroom, heading not for Elias, but for the stage, where Marcus Sterling stood alone, a king in a castle made of ash. Elias stood up. He felt a wave of exhaustion hit him so hard his knees buckled. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind the pain of his ribs, the stinging of his cuts, the crushing weight of the last 3 days. He was dizzy. The room spun, a kaleidoscope of gold and light. He turned away from the stage. He didn't want the interviews. He didn't want the fame. He wanted air. He began to walk toward the side exit, weaving through the tuxedoed crowd. People stared at him, some with awe, some with fear, but no one stopped him. He was untouchable now. He was the man who had burned down the library to save the book. He pushed through the heavy double doors into the cool, quiet corridor of the service hallway. The roar of the ballroom faded to a dull hum behind him. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. He rested his head against the plaster, closing his eyes. "You did good, kid." Elias opened one eye. Saul Rourke was standing at the end of the hallway, leaning against a linen cart. He was holding a glass of stolen champagne in one hand and his phone in the other. "It's trending," Saul grinned, waving the phone. #Clara Vance is the #1 topic in the world right now. Wikipedia is already locked for editing. You broke the internet, Elias. "I'm tired, Saul," Elias whispered. "I bet you are." Saul walked over and handed him the champagne. "Drink this. Then we gotta go. The cops will want a statement, and I prefer we give it on our terms, not while you're wearing a muddy tux." Elias took the glass. He didn't drink. He just held it, feeling the cold condensation against his palm. "Did you see him?" Elias asked. The cleaner? Silas. Saul's face darkened. I saw him slip out the kitchen exit while everyone was watching the old lady. He's gone, Elias. Men like that. They don't get caught. He'll go underground. You'll have to watch your back. I don't care, Elias said. He can't kill the story now. It's out. Yeah. Saul looked down at him with a strange expression, respect, perhaps, or maybe just relief. It's out. You saved her, Elias. You actually did it. Elias closed his eyes again. He thought of the cold river. He thought of the fire in his shop. He thought of the lonely grave in Beacon with the word silence buried beneath the mud. She saved me, Elias murmured. The doors at the end of the hall burst open. Police officers, uniformed and serious, marched in. Elias Thorne, the lead officer asked, hand resting on his holster. Elias cracked a weary smile. He raised his champagne glass in a toast. That's me, he said. I'm the bookbinder. The spring sun that filtered through the high, arched windows of the new workshop in Chelsea was nothing like the gray, oppressive light of the basement in Brooklyn. It was a clean, forgiving illumination, carrying with it the scent of blooming magnolias from the Highline Park nearby, mixing gently with the familiar, grounding aromas of bookbinding paste, leather, and aging paper. Elias Thorne stood at his workbench, a place of peace that felt light years away from the freezing currents of the Hudson River, though only 6 months had passed since the night the world changed. He was no longer the desperate fugitive shivering in a boathouse. He was a man anchored by gravity and truth, though the scar on his forehead, a jagged, pale lightning bolt running into his hairline, remained a permanent map of the fire he had walked through. He picked up the bone folder, the same tool he had used the night he found the letter, and ran it along the spine of a 19th century botanical atlas. The motion was rhythmic, meditative. Swipe, press, smooth. In the quiet of the shop, the sound was like a heartbeat. The world outside the glass storefront was noisy with the bustle of New York City, a city that had chewed him up and spat him out, only to embrace him as a folk hero. But Elias didn't care for the heroism. He didn't care for the magazine covers that had dubbed him the librarian who burned down the lie, or the talk show invitations that piled up unopened on his desk. He only cared about the work. The work was the only thing that made sense. You take something broken, something forgotten and falling apart, and you make it whole again. You don't hide the cracks, you honor them. You let the history breathe. The bell above the door jingled, a soft, brassy note that broke his concentration. Elias didn't look up immediately. He finished the crease, wiped the excess starch from the leather, and then set the tool down. When he turned, he saw a young woman standing in the entrance. She was holding a book against her chest with both hands, clutching it as if it were oxygen. She looked to be about 20, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days, the eyes of a writer. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just Elias," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "How can I help you?" I didn't come for a restoration," she stammered, stepping forward into the pool of sunlight. She held the book out to him. It was a hardcover, pristine and new, the dust jacket a deep, midnight blue. "I just wanted you to sign it. If that's okay. It saved my life." Elias looked at the book. The title was embossed in silver letters that seemed to shimmer. The Silent Lark. And below it, in a font that was sharp and unapologetic, a novel by Clara Vance. Elias felt a tightness in his throat, a phantom sensation of the river water choking him, but it passed quickly, replaced by a warm, melancholic pride. He took the book. It was heavy. It was real. It wasn't a secret hidden in a basement anymore. It was mass-produced, sitting on shelves in airports and libraries, resting on nightstands, being read on subways. The lie of Eleanor Vance had been dismantled, not with malice, but with the sheer, undeniable weight of Clara's voice. "I'd be honored," Elias said softly. He took a pen from his pocket and opened the cover. He didn't write his name. Instead, he wrote the date and below it, a single phrase, "Listen to the silence." He handed it back. The girl looked at the inscription and teared up. "Thank you," she whispered. "She gets it. She really gets it." The loneliness. Yes, Elias said, looking past her, out the window at the busy street. She did. When the girl left, the shop fell silent again, but the air felt charged. It was time. Elias had been putting it off for weeks, burying himself in work, finding excuses in the minutiae of running the new business funded by the settlement from the Sterling lawsuit. But the book in the girl's hands had been a sign. He took off his apron, folding it neatly on the stool. He walked to the back of the shop, to a specialized, climate-controlled safe. He punched in the code 1948, Clara's birth year. The heavy door swung open. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was not a book, but a collection of preserved pages. The original notebook. The water-swollen, mud-stained spiral pad that had survived the Hudson. Elias had spent 3 months stabilizing it, using every trick of conservation chemistry to freeze the decay, to lock the ink into the paper fibers so it wouldn't fade. It looked like a shipwreck, battered and warped, but it was beautiful. It was the holy relic of a martyr who had finally found her religion. Elias placed the notebook into a custom-made travel case. He put on his coat, a new one, warm and dry. He locked the shop, turning the sign to closed, and walked toward Penn Station. He was going north. The train ride was a ghost echo of his terrifying flight 6 months ago. The tracks were the same, the rhythm of the wheels on the steel rails was the same, but the landscape had softened. The gray, skeletal trees of October were gone, replaced by the lush, vibrant green of late spring. The Hudson River, once a black monster, was now a glittering ribbon of sapphire reflecting the blue sky. Elias sat by the window, watching the water. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a strange kinship with the river. It had tried to kill him, yes, but it had also washed him clean. It had stripped away the timid man he used to be and forged him into something durable. He thought about the headlines that had dominated the winter. The downfall of the Sterling Empire had been swift and brutal. The video of Margaret's confession had gone viral within minutes of the gala. By the next morning, the Eleanor Vance Heritage Foundation was under investigation by the FBI for fraud and embezzlement. Marcus Sterling had tried to flee, his private jet intercepted on the tarmac at Teterboro. He was currently awaiting trial under house arrest, his assets frozen, his name synonymous with deceit. And Silas? The cleaner? Elias looked at the reflection of the other passengers in the train window. He scanned the faces automatically. Old habits died hard. Silas had vanished. The police found no trace of him. Saul Rourke, who had visited the shop a few weeks ago looking healthier and sober, had told Elias that men like Silas don't get caught. They just fade into the background until the heat dies down or a new employer calls. Elias knew he would always have to look over his shoulder, just a little. But he refused to live in fear. That was what they wanted. That was how they had controlled Clara. Fear was the cage, and Elias had broken the lock. The train slowed as it approached Beacon. The station was familiar, but the air felt different as he stepped onto the platform. It smelled of wet earth and life. Elias rented a car this time. He drove through the town, past the diner where he had once hidden in a bathroom, past the alley where he had ditched his phone. He drove up the winding road to the old St. Jude's property. The rusted gates were gone. The ominous no trespassing signs had been removed. In their place was a modest, tasteful wooden sign, the Clara Vance Memorial Park and Literary Garden. The site was still under construction, but the transformation had begun. The main asylum building, that Gothic horror of red brick, was being gutted. It was going to be a library and a writer's retreat. The darkness was being scrubbed out, replaced by light. But Elias drove past the main building. He headed for the tree line, to the small cemetery that overlooked the river. He parked the car and walked the rest of the way. The grass had been trimmed. The weeds that had once choked the graves of the forgotten were gone, replaced by beds of wildflowers, daisies, violets, and black-eyed Susans swaying in the gentle breeze. Elias walked down the rows of numbered stones until he reached the edge of the cliff. The spot where he had jumped was fenced off now, a safety railing installed for the visitors who came to pay their respects. And there were visitors. Even on a Tuesday afternoon, a dozen people were wandering the grounds. Some sat on benches reading, Others stood silently by the graves. But Elias's destination was the stone that had started it all. It was no longer a rough, hand-carved marker half buried in mud. The foundation's new board of directors, overseen by Margaret's legal team, had commissioned a new headstone. It was simple, made of unpolished gray granite that looked like it had grown from the earth. Clara Jane Vance, 1948 to 1975, author of The Silent Lark, I Am the Shadow, and She is the Thief of Light. But the light has returned. The grave was covered in tributes. Pens, hundreds of them, were stuck into the earth around the stone like a strange, bristling garden. There were letters, poems held down by pebbles, and small wooden carvings of larks. It was a chaotic, beautiful shrine to the misunderstood. Elias knelt in the grass. His knees popped, a reminder of the impact from the fall, the ache that flared up when it rained. He opened the travel case and took out the preserved notebook. He didn't intend to leave it here. It belonged in the museum they were building, climate-controlled and safe for future generations. But he needed to bring it back one last time. He needed to close the circle. I did it, Elias whispered. The wind carried his voice away, mixing it with the rustle of the leaves and the distant murmur of the river below. They know you now, Clara. They know the song. He traced the letters of her name on the cold stone. He thought about the woman who had sat in that cold basement, writing words of such transcendent beauty while the world above ignored her existence. He thought about her rage, her sorrow, and her ultimate defiance. She hadn't burned the house down with fire. She had burned it down with truth. She had planted a time bomb in the binding of a book, trusting that one day, someone would care enough to look beneath the surface. I'm sorry it took so long, Elias said, his voice cracking. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked his eyes. He wasn't crying for the danger he had faced. He was crying for the years she had lost. He was crying for every artist who had been silenced, for every voice that had been stolen. A shadow fell over him. Elias tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the case, but then he relaxed. The presence didn't feel threatening. He turned. Margaret was there. She was in her wheelchair, pushed by a young nurse, but she looked stronger than she had on the stage at the plaza. The weight of the secret was gone from her shoulders. She was wearing a bright yellow scarf, the color of a goldfinch. I knew you'd be here, Margaret said, her voice raspy but warm. She waved the nurse away, rolling herself the last few feet to sit beside Elias. It's a good day for a visit, Elias said, wiping his eyes. Margaret looked at the grave, then at the notebook in Elias's hands. She reached out and touched the protective casing. You saved her, Elias. You didn't just find the book. You saved her soul. She saved mine, too, Elias admitted. I was hiding, Margaret. In my shop. In the past. I liked old books because they couldn't hurt me. They were done. Finished. But Clara. She taught me that the past isn't done. It's just holding its breath. Margaret nodded slowly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was a silver locket. This was hers, Margaret said. She managed to hide it from the nurses. When they took her away to this place. She pressed it into my hand. She didn't have anything inside it. No picture. Just empty space. She handed the locket to Elias. The metal was warm from her hand. She wanted to fill it, Margaret whispered. She wanted a life to put inside it. She never got that life. I want you to have it. Margaret, I can't. Take it, she commanded gently. You filled the empty space, Elias. You gave her a life after death. You are the only family she has left. Elias closed his fingers around the locket. It felt heavy, like an anchor. He nodded, unable to speak. They sat there for a long time, the old woman and the bookbinder, watching the sun begin to dip toward the Catskill Mountains across the river. The light turned golden, bathing the cemetery in a warm, amber glow. It was the magic hour, the time cinematographers loved, when the world looked more real, more vivid than at any other moment. What will you do now? Margaret asked eventually. Elias looked out at the river. He saw a hawk circling the thermals, rising higher and higher. I'm going to finish the restoration, he said. Not just the notebook. I have a backlog of clients. People are bringing me their family Bibles, their grandmother's diaries, their letters from the war. They don't want them to be valuable. They just want them to be remembered. He smiled. I'm going to be the keeper of the small stories. The ones the foundations don't care about. A good vocation, Margaret said. Elias stood up. He helped Margaret turn her chair back toward the path. Are you coming? She asked. In a minute, Elias said. I just need one more second. Margaret nodded and rolled away, the nurse joining her. Elias stood alone at the cliff's edge. He looked down at the spot where he had jumped. He remembered the cold, the darkness, the feeling of the water pulling him down. And then he remembered the fire in the boathouse. The spark. He opened the locket in his hand. It was empty, a small oval of silver. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny scrap of paper, a trimming from the restoration of the notebook, a blank piece of the original 1974 paper that had fallen off during the process. He had saved it. He took his pen and drew a small, simple shape on the paper. A bird. A lark. Wings spread. He folded the paper and placed it inside the locket. He snapped it shut. Click. Fly, he whispered. Elias turned and walked away from the edge. He walked past the grave, past the flowers, past the pens stuck in the earth. He walked toward the car, toward the train, toward the city that was waiting for him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He carried the silence with him, but it wasn't a heavy silence anymore. It was the silence of a library after the doors are closed, a silence that was full of millions of words waiting to be read. As he reached the crest of the hill, a flock of birds erupted from the trees near the riverbank. They swirled into the sky, a chaotic cloud of motion, chattering and singing, rising up against the blue. They were loud. They were messy. They were alive. Elias Thorne smiled, the scar on his forehead catching the last of the sunlight. He put his hands in his pockets and began to hum, a quiet, steady tune, joining the chorus of the living world. The shadow author had stepped into the light, and the story, finally, was complete.